In the summer of 2003, Suzanne Summers was sitting in a beauty salon when a receptionist said John Ritter was calling. She had not heard his voice in years, yet 2 words were enough. "Hey, babe." Then he said something that made Suzanne want to challenge him immediately. She stopped herself and answered with only a few words. Before they hung up, Jack and Chrissy suddenly had a future again, perhaps with Janet beside them. Roughly 1 month later, John died without warning. Why did Suzanne swallow the answer she wanted to give, and what had taken them more than 20 years to reach that call? The answer begins in another home, where a frightened girl learned that belonging could disappear with the sound of a man entering the room. Long before John Ritter's voice returned through a telephone, Suzanne Marie Mahoney learned to measure danger by her father's footsteps. Born on October 16, 1946, in San Bruno, California, she was the third of 4 children in a working-class Catholic family. Her father, Frank, had returned from World War II to a job loading beer cases onto boxcars, then came home from the brewery drunk and continued drinking through the night. Furniture broke, insults crossed the house, and his wife and children learned to disappear before his rage found them. On the worst nights, Suzanne's mother gathered the children into a cedar closet and hid there with them. At school, undiagnosed dyslexia turned letters and numbers into another threat. Teachers saw a girl who could not keep up. At home, her father supplied the explanation she feared was true, calling her stupid, until the word began to feel like a fact. The night before her first junior prom, Suzanne's mother finished a dress they had spent a week choosing and sewing together. It hung on the back of the closet door, a rare promise that the 16-year-old might leave the house and be seen as someone beautiful. Frank entered her room drunk, mocked her for imagining boys might notice her, then seized the dress and tore it in half. When her mother protested, he struck her. Suzanne, standing on the bed to get away, reached down for a tennis racket and brought it down on her father's head hard enough to give him a concussion. Her mother took him to the hospital. Suzanne stayed behind and cleaned his blood from the room, the walkway, and the family's white picket fence. By morning, the dress was still torn, her father was in the hospital, and Suzanne was asleep in the same closet where the family had learned to hide from him. At 18, Suzanne became pregnant and left college before she had been given much chance to discover who she might become. She married Bruce Summers at 19, gave birth to their son, Bruce Jr., and was divorced by 22, a young mother taking modeling, sales, and television jobs while rent and bills waited at home. Then, in 1971, 6-year-old Bruce was struck by a car and nearly died. For months, he woke from nightmares and night sweats. The medical costs deepened the pressure, and mother and son both entered therapy to face what the accident had opened in them. 6 years later, John Ritter would meet Suzanne as a last-minute audition choice with almost no comedy training. Nothing in Chrissy Snow's smile would reveal the woman who already knew how quickly an ordinary day could split a family apart, or how much work waited after everyone else went home. A few seconds as the unnamed blonde in the white Thunderbird in American Graffiti made Suzanne recognizable without even giving her character a name. Later, visits with Johnny Carson kept that face in circulation, and ABC remembered it when Three's Company still could not find the right Chrissy. Suzanne nearly missed the chance, because the day before her audition, she and Alan Hamill had been aboard a small plane in the Caribbean when lightning closed around it and the aircraft dropped hundreds of feet. Passengers were warned it might crash. After landing, Suzanne could barely make herself board another flight, but production in Los Angeles was almost ready to begin, and she went anyway. John Ritter and Joyce DeWitt were already cast, and Suzanne arrived with almost no time left to win the room. ABC hired her after the test. She crossed the country with the terror of one falling aircraft still in her body, then stepped into apartment 201. John, Joyce, and Suzanne had arrived as strangers. Within weeks, their timing would make viewers believe that front door had always opened for all three. Suzanne had never studied comedy, so she watched John. He could vault over a sofa, fold himself across a chair, or turn a startled retreat into a dance, then repeat the fall from the same angle on the next take, without making it look rehearsed. She studied the pause before his body moved, and the way Jack's reaction could make another character's line twice as funny. Many of Chrissy's lines were simple misunderstandings, but John listened as if her logic might be right. Let doubt cross Jack's face and made the audience discover the mistake with him. Suzanne learned not to chase the laugh. She gave him something sincere enough to believe for one dangerous second. John, in turn, understood that Chrissy could not merely be foolish. Suzanne played her as innocent, literal, and incapable of malice. A woman whose logic wandered, but whose moral compass did not. Jack did not laugh at her from a distance. He was pulled into the world she created and fought his way back out. Joyce gave Janet the steadiness that held both of them together. Suzanne would later say that Jack and Janet felt like the parents, while Chrissy was the child, allowing her to live a childhood on television that fear had denied her at home. When Three's Company premiered in 1977, the premise sounded risky for network television. One man sharing an apartment with two single women while pretending to be gay so the landlord would tolerate the arrangement. What viewers returned for was less scandalous and more intimate. When one story literally handcuffed Jack and Chrissy together, every stumble depended on each performer feeling the other's movement before the audience saw it. Jack cooked. Janet rolled her eyes. Chrissy misunderstood a sentence. And by the closing credits, the three roommates had usually repaired whatever confusion had shaken their home. Even their chaos carried a promise. However many doors slammed, Jack, Janet, and Chrissy would be at the same table the following week. Their timing made the apartment feel lived in. Suzanne came from work and still had to make dinner for her son. John carried the responsibility of leading a production built around his physical precision. Joyce had trained for years before the break arrived. Yet on Tuesday nights, those separate lives compressed into a sofa, a kitchen table, and a front door friends entered without knocking. Suzanne passed over several film opportunities while the series was consuming her time. She had finally found the place that made her visible, and she placed much of her future inside it. By the fifth season, success had changed the temperature behind that door. Suzanne earned about $30,000 an episode. Alan, now negotiating for her, asked for $150,000 plus a share of the profits, using John's pay and the salaries of comparable male stars as the measure. Suzanne and Alan saw equality, while ABC treated the demand as an ultimatum. A CBS arrangement during the hiatus and her absence from several tapings had already hardened the network's position, while the cast and producers still had a weekly show to finish. Allen later said an anonymous caller warned that executives intended to hang a nun in the marketplace, making Suzanne an example for other actresses. None of that power belonged to John. He had not set her salary and could not fire her, yet his name appeared in every comparison, while he and Joyce returned to rehearsal, unsure whether their third partner would be there. Suzanne later believed his anger came from losing the performer whose timing his own depended on, not from the number she had asked ABC to pay. Suzanne still owed the production work, but she no longer entered it as a member of the family. A security guard met her at the back door and escorted her past the main set without allowing her to see John, Joyce, or the regular cast and crew. On a small side set, there was a chair, a lamp, and a telephone. A wardrobe employee brought in her clothes. One camera recorded roughly a minute of dialogue, and then the guard led her out again. The script said Chrissy had gone home to care for her sick mother and was calling Jack and Janet from her parents' house. Viewers could still hear the familiar voice at the other end of the line, but Suzanne was no longer permitted to step into the apartment that had made that voice famous. She later described the treatment as punishment for being a bad girl. The father who had torn her dress was nowhere near the studio, yet the old verdict had followed her through the back entrance.
When the final telephone tag ended, Hollywood went quiet.
Suzanne later remembered sitting in her living room on a cold, gray day, asking why she had risked the best job she had ever held. Three's Company kept moving without her. John and Joyce kept working. The face once everywhere became a warning other employers preferred not to touch. Eventually, she carried the one asset ABC could not take. Millions of viewers still knew her name. In Las Vegas, she accepted the humiliation of being treated like a discarded sitcom star and learned, one audience at a time, to hold a room without a laugh track. By 1987, she was Las Vegas Female Entertainer of the Year. Step by Step later gave her 7 seasons inside another television family, while more than 10 million thigh masters turned her image into an empire she controlled. The reversal was enormous, but it answered only the question of whether Suzanne could survive. It could not return one ordinary year with John and Joyce. Then, in 1995, chance placed Suzanne beside the one person who could carry her back across that distance. During the Broadway premiere of Victor/Victoria, Amy Yazbek entered the women's room and found Suzanne there. Amy introduced herself as John's partner, learned Suzanne would sing at the after-party, and promised to make sure he said hello. Back in the theater, she asked John to name the last person he wanted to see there, then told him Suzanne was in the building. He remained shaken through the rest of the performance. At the party, after Suzanne sang, she turned, watched John walk toward her, and met him in an embrace. Amy later said John had never wanted to attack Suzanne publicly and had continued to love his former friend from afar. For that moment, there was no producer, contract, or camera between them. Eventually, the party ended around them. They returned to separate lives, and the ordinary calls that might have turned one embrace back into a friendship never began. 5 years after that embrace, Suzanne was diagnosed with breast cancer. Treatment placed mortality inside her daily life. But John was still someone she remembered rather than someone she regularly called. 3 years later, in the summer of 2003, she was sitting in a beauty salon when the receptionist said John Ritter was on the telephone. Unlike the phone tags the studio once wrote for Chrissy, this call existed because John himself had chosen to make it. Suzanne took the receiver and heard the greeting that collapsed the years at once. "Hey, babe." It was affectionate, familiar, and close enough to the old rhythm that she knew the voice before he had to identify himself. Yet John had not called merely to remember Jack and Chrissy. He had something to say about the rupture neither of them had ever truly finished discussing, and he delivered it without the long explanation Suzanne might have expected. Then John said, "I forgive you." Her first response, "You forgive me?" rose at once because she believed she had been the person expelled from the show and punished for asking to be valued, while John had remained inside. Their embrace in 1995 had acknowledged the affection, but it had never answered that old question. Suzanne could challenge his choice of words and risk letting the past take over again, or she could protect the reason he had finally called. She swallowed the challenge and said, "Thanks." The answer was only one word, yet it kept the line open. John told her about 8 simple rules and a nightmare sequence in which he wanted Suzanne and Joyce to appear. For the first time since those isolated phone tags, Jack, Chrissy, and Janet were being spoken of in the future tense by 2 of the people who had played them. There was no studio between the voices now, no salary figure, and no side set. Only a decision about what they might still do with the years ahead. Suzanne wanted to work with him, but not as the joke inside a nightmare. She told John that the audience had waited too long to see them together again for their return to disappear after a brief dream. Why not find a proper project for the 2 of them? Something that allowed the chemistry to grow older instead of treating the past as a punchline. John agreed that they would both look. Suzanne had long imagined Jack Tripper and Chrissy Snow eventually marrying. Now there was at least a path toward discovering what their older selves might become. Nothing had been signed when they hung up. There was no title, no script, and no first meeting on a calendar. Only a shared intention to find the right way back. Yet for the first time since a guard had placed her beside that telephone on the side set, Suzanne was no longer outside John's future. About 1 month later, on September 11th, 2003, John began sweating, feeling nauseated and suffering pain in his chest while rehearsing 8 simple rules. He was taken across the street to Providence St. Joseph Medical Center, the same Burbank hospital where he had been born. Doctors initially treated him for a presumed heart attack, but the emergency was a type A aortic dissection, a tear in the body's largest artery. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and surgery could not save him. Roughly 4 hours after entering the hospital, John was dead. He was 54, 6 days short of his 55th birthday, and the date was also the 5th birthday of his youngest child. The project he and Suzanne had agreed to seek never received a page, a set, or a first meeting. She had spent more than 20 years imagining what might have been said. When John finally called, the future they chose lasted only weeks. Suzanne later said the call gave her resolution, not because it decided who had been right, but because their final act was no longer silence. John had reached for her, Suzanne had kept the line open, and both had chosen a future. 9 years later, Joyce DeWitt sat opposite Suzanne on her online program, more than 30 years after their last meeting, and greeted her with an embrace. Each woman described the rupture from the side on which she had lived it. Joyce had returned to a cast under pressure, while Suzanne had been isolated, labeled greedy, and removed from the room. For once, No producer stood between their accounts. When John's name came up, both women cried. Suzanne had now reached both former roommates. Joyce could answer her embrace. John could not. By then, Suzanne had lived through more than a decade of breast cancer and the destruction of her Malibu home in a 2007 wildfire, watching clothes, scripts, and keepsakes turn to ash before beginning again. She lived another 11 years after embracing Joyce. When cancer eventually returned, Suzanne died 15th, 2023, with Alan, Bruce, and other loved ones near her, one day before her 77th birthday. Her family had gathered to celebrate it. Instead, they ate her favorite cake in her memory the next day. John had died on his youngest child's 5th birthday, while Suzanne left on the eve of her own. For one family, the date already belonged to a 5-year-old. For the other, a cake was waiting for 77. Neither birthday could remain what it had been meant to be. On Three's Company, a misunderstanding could lock Jack, Janet, and Chrissy on opposite sides of a door, but 22 minutes later, the door opened and the apartment was home again. Outside the show, their real rupture consumed more than 20 years. The first telephone allowed Chrissy's voice to remain, while keeping Suzanne away from John and Joyce. The last telephone carried John's voice back to her. The past was still disputed, but Suzanne chose thanks, and John chose a future. The first call was written to separate them. The last call almost brought them home. Time never gave them a third. That is why apartment 201 can still feel warm and painful at once. The family survived perfectly in reruns, while the people who created it reached one another only just before it was too late. When you remember Jack, Janet, and Chrissy, which moment makes that apartment feel like home again? Tell us below. And if you want more stories about the people behind the shows we still carry with us, subscribe and stay with us.